Hey family, welcome to We All Need Each Other, the podcast from Transformation Ministry. Let me tell you some facts. Each one of us has unique ways of thinking, gifts, talents, and experiences. Each one of us was made in the image of God. Although those things are very real and very true, it is also true that we reflect the image of God very differently. When we come together with our differences and our uniqueness, we can help each other. We can help each other understand different perspectives and broaden our own perspectives. We can help each other grow and learn and understand the beauty of God and also the complexity of this world. That's why we wanted to bring you this podcast. In this podcast, we're going to get real. We're going to bring in guests that talk about things like faith, race, politics, relationships, ministry, and justice. With all that being said, I just want to say thank you for being here. And thank you for joining us on We All Need Each Other.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us again here on episode 9 of We All Need Each Other. Very excited about today's conversation. This is a topic that Dan and I have been interested in talking about for a while, and we have a great guest here to be able to share with us about what it means to be a neighbor. Really important topic just in the Bible, but then I think has a lot of practical impact on what we're all doing in our daily lives. So very glad to welcome Shannan Martin. And I know some of you may be familiar with her writing or just her being active here in our local community, but Shannan, I'll let you introduce yourself to our podcast community.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. My name is Shannan. I live here in Goshen, Indiana, so not far at all from you all. My husband, Corey, and I have lived here now and our kids. We've lived here for about 10 years now. And our kiddos that are still at home are junior in high school, freshman in high school, 7th grader. And then our oldest is out on his own, living his life in Elkhart. So the biggest part of our story that I know we're going to dig into a lot today is that those 10 years ago, we picked up and moved our family from living kind of out in the middle of nowhere and what we saw very much as our picture perfect dream farmhouse. We assumed that we would live in that real small community out in the country. We thought we'd be there forever and raise our children there. And, it's the life that we always wanted. And once we sort of had that in our hands, we could never have imagined letting go of that. But we were just really captured at some point by this idea of kind of being among people in a way that we really had not been before. We were captured by God's heart for people that are at the margins for all different kinds of reasons. And, for us at the time, this was revelatory. It was one of those things that we had to kind of stop and say, we had both grown up in Christian homes our entire lives, and yet somehow these ideas had escaped us. And it was sort of disorienting to come to terms with that and to suddenly see things so differently. So, we did pick up our family and move to just a very unassuming kind of overlooked neighborhood here in Goshen. And now 10 years later, it's really all, especially my 2 youngest, it's really all they know. It felt like just such a huge transition, and it was, but now, we're on the other side of it a little bit, and this is just our life.
Yep.
So yeah. And I guess I'll add also, I work part-time as a cook at the soup kitchen in town. That's where I just came from today. And my husband, Corey, since we've lived in this home, so it's a fairly newer thing for him as well, but he became the chaplain of the Elkhart County Jail. He's a full-time chaplain there, maybe a couple of years after moving to the neighborhood. So that kind of sums us up.
Yep. And then also a writer as well. So
yes, I'm a writer. That's true.
Yep. We'll make sure we get this in the show notes, but Ministry of Ordinary Places and Falling Free, right?
Yes, I've got them right here beside me. I'm glad you kind of brought that up. But since we're on video, first book and second book. So
wonderful. So we'll definitely get those in the show notes. But I love writing myself. So really appreciate that side of your story too. And
Yeah.
we will put this in the show notes too, but I know we were saying, but I mentioned before we got on recording that my wife and I are both huge fans of your Instagram account. So plug to @Shannan Writes on Instagram. People should
Thank
definitely go and follow you.
Thank you.
Just a lot of really powerful, stories of just your family's experience. And then again, one of the reasons we want to talk to you today of just what it means to be a neighbor in your local community. So I think that would be a great place to start, actually, because
Sure.
if you look at your Instagram account, the first word you use to describe yourself in your bio is neighbor, right? And so I'd be interested, like in the Bible, Jesus says the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So what does this idea of being a neighbor mean to you, and kind of how do you live that out?
Well, I think moving into a neighborhood is what gave me the I guess the perception or the understanding that we talk a lot in church cultures about what is our calling, what are we called to, and I had always heard those verses. I don't think you can be a part of church culture for very long without picking up on this idea of love your neighbors yourself. But I guess I had never really given it a lot of thought. And at the point that we found ourselves really in a new environment that was unfamiliar to us, in some ways uncomfortable to us, it was just all very new. I began to understand that to live as a neighbor is our calling for every single one of us, no matter where we live. I want to be really clear that while my story involved selling the farm and picking up and moving and all those things, I mean, typically that's not going to be the response. It's not even necessarily, I don't think, the point always. For some of us it will be, but I think no matter where we're at, we're not off the hook here. We are called to live as though neighbor is really part of our spiritual DNA. So when you said that's the first word in my bio, I just was here like, oh, is it?
Yeah.
Now, I am the one that wrote that, and it doesn't surprise me, but I do think I began to just slowly reframe, who am I and who am I in Christ, and what is my real identity? And I really do think that it kind of begins, with God for me, because I'm a person of faith, and then with living as a neighbor. That's really central to the way I want to order my life.
Yeah, that's so great. And it actually ties into staying with your Instagram account. You recently made a post on Instagram that I want to ask you about, talking about how a decade ago, I think you used these exact words. You said you wondered if you had missed the central piece of following Jesus, to be a neighbor, and that now you've found this really hopeful community that reveals God in new ways. But it sounds like that was a process that took a while. I feel like sometimes it can almost feel like this has to be this instant change of going from maybe not fully understanding what this idea of being a neighbor means to, okay, now I've got to just be connecting with my neighbors in all these really meaningful ways. And I just sort of have to flip that switch. I guess talk a little bit about what that process is like for you, and how it took some time to get to that point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's really slow work. And that's one of the things that we've got to work against in ourselves, especially for me, from the perspective of a white woman who lived most of my life in almost exclusively white circles. We in particular have this idea of kind of these dramatic, almost, big reveal moments in life. And so if I'm being honest, I tried to work against that from the start, but I can look back now, I've got the benefit of hindsight, and really see that I did imagine something different than what my life here has turned out to be, that I did picture it more, I don't know if it's just if it's social media, if it's our culture, if it's this, this made for TV sort of thing, but it's never been a big dramatic thing. It wasn't a big dramatic shift. It was just time. It is slow work, and it takes time. And when I say it takes time, I mean, it takes years sometimes, because like you said, we can come into a place and have this idea of, the question I was asking myself, I guess, was, okay, now here we are. What am I supposed to do? I just could not escape the fact that there was this thing that I was supposed to be doing. And so in that, there was some kind of saviorism happening,
Yeah.
because it's just this, it's kind of this force within us of like, we've got to be performing, we've got to be contributing, we've got to be just whatever. We want to put metrics around things. All of these things that are kind of ingrained in us throughout our life don't bear out well in neighboring, you know, and living as a neighbor. It's just presence. And it's the willingness to be, you know, there's the verse that I was fed throughout my childhood and throughout youth group and all those things, that we're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world.
Yep.
I think it's kind of flipped. I think we do need to be, we need to be of our place and not just in our place. And being of a place takes time. I mean, you can't just show up on day one and say, you know, you can be in your place on day one, but it takes time to be of the place. And so that's work that is ongoing. That's work that is still uncomfortable for me in some ways, and just kind of exhaling every day and saying, you know, this is my life. I'm just living my regular life here. But I'm looking for connection with the people around me. And it doesn't mean, like you kind of hinted to this, but this idea of, you know, then I'm just going to be constantly with my neighbors and we're going to be doing these amazing things together. And that's not the way life works for me or for my neighbors. So it's a lot of just daily living. It's me, I face the camera this way because behind me, my kitchen is full of tomatoes. Today is the day I'm dealing with tomatoes. I mean, we've just got things to do.
Yeah.
But to be looking for those opportunities for connection when they come, and to understand that those, you know, we don't have to even necessarily become best friends forever with all of the people around us, but to come to a place where we know that they have our back and they know that we have their back. That's a really special place to land.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So many things that I want to keep going to in your answer right there. I think that's really fascinating stuff. One of those, you mentioned kind of this idea of sort of that savior narrative, right? Of like, we're bringing something to people. And I don't know if this is, I mean, it sounds like I maybe had a similar upbringing as you, where I grew up in sort of a conservative, you know, white evangelical community. Yeah. And I don't know if it comes from sort of the putting missionary work on a pedestal, which absolutely nothing against missionary work. There are people doing incredible work as missionaries. But I know in my upbringing, it was always this kind of notion that, yeah, we're taking something, the gospel, we're taking work, we're taking, you know, something to this place that desperately needs us to bring it. And I think as I've gotten older, the book, When Helping Hurts, I read that in college, was a big catalyst for me in this. It's like, sometimes that way of thinking is not helpful at all. Yeah. And I wonder, like, how do we shed that? Like, what's been your process in sort of, not bringing that savior narrative to the conversation? Yeah.
I mean, I think I personally would take it a step further and say, not only is it not always helpful, I think it's almost always harmful.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's, you know, that's one of the things that pretty quickly, that I think that's one way that we kind of become more understanding of the fact that we are of a place rather than just in a place, is that pretty quickly, and you know, some of this work, thankfully, we were able to do at the start, but I look behind me and see how much we've grown. I hope in 10 years I look at me right now and notice how much I've grown. But we started to hear feedback from others around us that we were, you know, when they knew we were moving into this place, into this neighborhood, that we were going to kind of bring God into this. You know, we live in a lower income neighborhood, and there, I became very struck by the fact that people hear of a lower income neighborhood and they attach that with the idea that the lower income neighborhood must be in need of God. Or Corey comes up against that with the jail, you know, that he needs to bring God into the jail. There's nowhere that God isn't already, you know. So the elementary school where we sent our kids right up the street here, it's a Title I school. When we arrived, it was a failing school, which is a terrible thing we do to schools by giving them these labels, but that's the way that it was. And so even there, it was like, okay, you know, people that could kind of come on board with this, the only way that some people could come to that acceptance was to think, okay, your kids are going to bring God into this school. God is very much already at work in the school, in the jail, in my neighborhood. And by the way, sometimes my kids were the kids bringing not God into the school or into the neighborhood, or you know what I mean? Like, to set up these dichotomies is a really damaging and dangerous narrative. And we've got to do that inner work and really being honest with ourselves. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I had completely eradicated that mentality from myself by the time I got here. That's ongoing work, because we have these impulses within us and we have to confront them. We have to be honest with ourselves about these corners of our hearts that are just, you know, they reveal themselves to be pretty dark and ugly. If we cannot be honest about these things that we've kind of absorbed from the air and from the culture around us, then we cannot do that work of expunging them from us. So yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's become a lot about being the ones who show up needy whenever possible. That's the biggest advice I give anybody who says, okay, like, what do I do? Where do I start? You've got to be willing to show up needy, because if I'm always going to be the one giving, whatever that might happen to look like, if I'm not receiving, and if I'm not only not receiving, but not showing up in need, not asking for help, then we're right back where we started. We're right back to that savior complex that is not going to do us any favors in building lasting and really meaningful relationships.
I just wanted to pause right here and say thank you. Thank you for joining us and being here with us on the We All Need Each Other podcast. If you want to support us, please don't hesitate to stop by our website, www.transformation58.com/give. Thanks. We all need each other.
I'm resonating so much with of what you're saying, just again, growing up in that more conservative background where, sometimes you would hear things like, oh, well, I learned as much from this group of people as I thought I brought to them. And even sometimes when I hear that, I'm almost like, okay, well, that sounds like you're surprised that you had that, you know what I mean? Like, and that shouldn't be the way it is either. I mean, I get that the heart behind that maybe is in a good place, but it's like, I like what you say of the idea of coming into the situation needy, of like expecting that this group of people that you're living with has something to give to you, completely apart from, you know, what is happening in your own life. Like, you're not the central person in that story.
Right. To be able to just say we're existing together. Yeah. You know, that we're just of this place together. We are of this neighborhood, this community together. I've just recently reflected, I mean, real recently, like a couple of weeks ago, I was somewhere and somebody referred to my neighborhood as, and not in a unkind way. It was very matter of fact, like, you know, this is the wrong side. We're on the wrong side of the tracks. And as soon as that was said, I was like, I don't like that. And my next thought was, I used to say that all the time. Yeah. Because when I arrived, there was almost this, like, you know, it was exciting. And I wanted to give context to where we were. And there was some pride there, I'm sure. But man, I just had one of those like cringy moments. Like, you know, I guess it really articulated for me, before I was of this place, I was comfortable using those words. Yep. I was in this place, but I was not of it yet. And so I was still comfortable saying, you know, this is the wrong side of the tracks. Now I'm much more of this place and I don't like it. Yep. You know, I very much see this as the right side of the tracks. And I wish more people would see that and experience that for themselves. But these are mistakes that we're going to make. And these are parts of the process. And it's part of that time continuum that these things do, you know, we just learn over time. Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And that kind of leads into my next question of, like, if somebody has maybe some baggage with this idea of being a neighbor from the past, because I mean, I resonate with what you just said a lot of, you know, I
have grown up and lived in the South Bend area my whole life. And I definitely look back at the way when I was in high school, I thought and even talked about some of the areas of South Bend that now
Yeah.
I've gotten to know and have met people from. And it's like, yeah, the ways that we talked about these places were harmful, you know?
Yeah.
So what do you do with that baggage, and how do you kind of, you know, grow from that? And again, this process you're talking about, like, what does that look like for people that maybe look back and are like, you know what, I haven't always been a good neighbor, and there's some maybe harmful things that I did in the past.
I think it's really humbling, you know,
Yeah.
and I think any opportunity for humility is one that we need to receive. Just allowing the discomfort of those feelings. We tend to be, as a culture, people who want to squash uncomfortable feelings. We want to run from them. We don't really want to deal with them, but we really don't want to talk about them. And honestly, that's why I'm talking about it to you right now.
Mhm.
Because there's something to, I haven't said what the story I just told you, I haven't said it out loud to anybody but my husband, but I've been thinking about it almost every day.
Yep.
You know, that one little moment in time it really illuminated to me kind of where I've been and where I am now. And, you know, even in some ways where I still need to go, you know, how far I need to go. But there's something to, not just doing that inner work, but to talking about it, to saying some of these
Yeah.
things out loud, to finding the right people and the right opportunity to really get honest about some of the mistakes that we've made, because those are learning opportunities for others around us. You know, so there are people who are right now maybe where I was 10 years ago, just in terms of they're younger, they're in a different phase of life, or they're just kind of coming to conclusions now that I came to in the past. I think it's helpful for us to be really transparent about the growth that we are continuing to encounter. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just part of the job. You know, it's part of the deal here is that I know that I have done and will continue to do things that are harmful to the people around me in every sphere of my life. Like a therapist said to me once, humans are going to hurt each other. It's just part of the deal here. So we're going to cause pain, we're going to cause harm. To be able to come around that, and to be honest about some of those areas is an important part of it, I think.
Yeah. If we're talking about being a good neighbor and being of a place, and you know, this idea that, again, that we talk about on this podcast a lot, of that, you know, everybody bears the image of God, right? We all need each other. Some of these phrases that we use, there might be times where we are in a place where some of our neighbors think differently than us, right? And there might be some difficult conversations that come up from that. So what do you think it looks like to be a good neighbor to someone like that just sees the world differently than we do? Or, I know this is a tough one for me personally, maybe it's people who think the way we used to think, that is a way that maybe, you know, we've, you know, kind of grown out of, or just are in a different place of life. Like, what does being a good neighbor to people like that look like?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that was in my brain for your last question, is in that humility of recognizing some of our past mistakes. It also comes with the responsibility to be gentle and to be patient with people who are in an earlier stage of the process, for lack of a better word. It's not really a cut and dried process, but you know, and that is another great opportunity for humility. And it's a struggle for me. It can be a big struggle for me, but on the other side, or, you know, maybe on my best days, I'm able to have empathy, a lot of empathy there in some cases, in saying, she is me. She is me 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or, you know, 20 years ago. I remember what it's like to think exactly like that. I remember what it's like to be afraid of certain things. I remember. And so as hard as it can be, especially I can kind of have sort of a bossy, bulldozery, you know, everything is cut and dried personality. It's helpful to be able to look at each other in a way that says, like, you know, I've been there. I remember this. You know, we can be gentle with each other. We can be direct when necessary. But these sorts of things are just, they're so nuanced, and the timeline can be so long. Having honest conversations, though, I think, you know, kind of going back to that last question, and just sharing our stories with each other goes a long way in those situations. But I will also say, with any luck, you said kind of, what is it like when we live near people who don't see the world the same way we do? With any luck, we do. With any luck, we live in a place where we are not surrounded by people who look and live and believe like we do. That's how I lived the first 30 years of my life, the first 35 years of my life. And I had no idea what I was missing. And so, yes, now in the process, the way I see the world is dramatically different than it used to be, but I'm still surrounded by people who in any number of ways don't look or live or believe as I do. We live in a neighborhood right now that has sort of the dueling political signs happening still, so you literally have people broadcasting their belief system right across the street from each other. And that can be kind of intense, when I can appreciate it in some ways because I tend to be kind of aware of my beliefs on my sleeve too. But what do you do when your feelings bump up against somebody else's and that person happens to be your neighbor? I did an Instagram post about that very topic. It's been quite some time ago, months ago. And just saying, that's my work right now is being a good neighbor to the people right across from me who fly a different flag than I do.
Yep.
And boy, I got pushback. I got intense pushback. I often know when I have pushback coming, and I'm usually okay with that. I was surprised by how many people were really saying, like, you don't owe them anything. And I think I understand the impulse to think that way, but I don't see that as helping our cause here. If we begin to think, we will be good neighbors to a certain person or to a certain belief system, I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind, so
absolutely.
It's challenging, but I think I can also see the ways I'm still receiving kindness from them.
Yeah.
And so it's a mutual thing in a perfect world, but I think finding small ways to show kindness and, to just smile when you see them, say hello, share food. I'm a big fan of sharing food. Drop off some berries or a loaf of banana bread or whatever, and just, do the work of treating your neighbors, like you said, as though they bear the full image of God, because they do. It's complicated. It's confusing, it's uncomfortable sometimes, but if we're going to believe it's true, then we've got to be willing to believe it's true even when it's hard for us.
Absolutely. So you just mentioned some practical things that you've done to neighbor other people, and I'd be interested in what are some other things, like bringing food, small acts of kindness, like what are some practical things like that you've done, and maybe what are some stories of the impact that you saw from that? Maybe it didn't happen in that moment, but later on down the road, like I guess talk about some of the practical side of what being a good neighbor looks like.
I think food is always I'm a foodie. I love to cook. I love to be in my kitchen. I love my little garden. That was one of the earliest things I knew to do, was to just show up with food, random food for people. And it seems like people are receptive to that. It's a good way to just open the door. Now I kind of tend to take things to the next level when it comes to neighboring sorts of things, but we not so long ago had some new neighbors move in, and we took them, I think it was in the fall or something, I don't know. I think we took them food as sort of like a welcome situation. And I'm like, they're telling me their names, and I am just like repeating them in my mind over and over again. And then I race home, and I have a file in my email. I have a folder in my email that's titled neighbor or neighbors. And I have an email that I keep a running tally of names, because we can't trust ourselves. Like, we've got to, at least I can't, we can't always remember these details. And it's important to me. I've learned over time that it's really important to just remember their names. Now, I haven't talked to these particular neighbors since that very day. We've smiled a little bit, we've waved a little bit. We haven't spent time together. We are not at that level, but I do remember their names because I've written them down. So I think it's this idea of, making that connection, but then pairing that with some real intention behind the scenes, so that I learned this the hard way, because there's nothing worse than having that big, hey, nice to meet you. We're so-and-so, you're so-and-so. And then you see each other 2 months later and you have to do it all again.
Yeah.
It's just these little things, I think, that can go a long way. And then I guess I'll share this because it's fresh in my mind also. When you said, what are some small things that I've done to be a good neighbor? We just last Thursday, I was cooking something, trying to scramble around and get dinner together before leaving for an away volleyball game for my daughter. And I had the burner on low and I kept thinking, okay, I'm just going to let this cook as long as I can before we leave. And then as soon as we're ready to go, I'm going to turn that burner off and we're going to go. So we end up in Bremen, which is, 30, 35 minutes away. And I sit down for this volleyball game. And I said to my son, did I turn off that burner? And he's like, I don't know, why would he know? And I just kept, because it's something I kept trying to remind myself to do. And I was not sure that I had done it. And that's bad. It's bad to leave a burner on when nobody's home. So I sent out a group text to 2 of my closest neighbors and said, is anybody home? Our back door is open. Can somebody please go check and see if I left my burner on? And they both responded, and one of them ran over. And so to say, what is something I've done to be a good neighbor? I've been needy.
Yeah.
I have shown up there was part of me that was like, I know my house is a disaster because we've been trying to do 10 things at once and get out the door. They now know that our back door is often open. There's all these things that kind of go through my mind, and just being embarrassed, like they're kind of seeing behind the curtain here, and that's awkward. And on top of all that, I left a stinking burner on and then drove, 20 miles away. But 2 days after that, a new neighbor who turned the burner off, emailed me or texted me and said, hey, can we borrow your wheelbarrow? We're doing a project. And I think this is the way that it works best.
Yep.
When we can just say, here we are in all of our complication and in all of our mess and in all of our kind of chaotic, messiness. Take us as we are, and we're going to do the same for you. So I'm just always going to come back to the best thing we can do to be a good neighbor is to show up needy.
That's so good. And I think that leads into then another question too so that was kind of, the question originally was sort of focused on what are some practical ways that you've been a good neighbor? But then, and you kind of just answered this, but what are some moments where someone's been a good neighbor to you that have really impacted you, where the sort of the focus of the situation is on somebody else and they're helping you out as a neighbor?
Yeah. I will say that text asking to borrow the wheelbarrow was really special to me because I thought, okay, this is working, this is, we're in this together. But just another example that is top of mind is our next door neighbors invited us over for one of the kids was turning 16, and she showed up at our door last week and said, I'm inviting you to my birthday party. I'm turning 16. It's Saturday. And we never miss those opportunities. They often invite us to birthday parties, but we were going to be gone all day Saturday. So we said, we're sorry, we're not going to be able to make it. We were bummed. And we got home Saturday about 8:00, and, the party started at 5. The party should be long over. And I was out kind of puttering in my garden, and her brother came out and said, hey, Shannan, the party's still going on in the basement if you guys want to come over. And so we wandered in. We'd been at the lake all day. We're sweaty, we're gross. They're all dressed to the nines. And they just cleared a space for us in their basement and started bringing us plates of food. And a lot of times, because we have a language barrier with this particular family and with everybody else they invite to parties, we always go, but it's always kind of like we're sort of the ones who can't communicate with the rest. And so oftentimes we'll be there for a while and then, we'll head out. This particular time, we were the last ones there. We kind of shut the party down and we just had so much fun together. And I sat there, we're eating food that we were just stuffing ourselves with food and just being in their home and thinking back, we're kind of reminiscing over things that kids have done together over the years. And it's kind of just that long haul mentality of we've just, here we still are 10 years later, and you've invited us into your home, and you didn't have to.
Yeah.
You really wanted us there, and you welcomed us in, you welcomed us as we are. That's just the best feeling ever. I mean, I don't know that it gets better than that. And it's so vulnerable. It's just a vulnerable thing to invite somebody into your home, and they just consistently do it. It's hard for me sometimes, and they just continue to kind of show me the way and show me that it doesn't have to be complicated, and we can just keep things simple, and we're going to do the best we can to communicate, and we're going to just we're going to rely on a lot of laughter and smiles and food.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but if you're loving this episode and you want to access any past episodes or show notes or more content, visit our website, www.transformation58.com/podcast. Okay, get back to the show.
Oh, well, that's such a practical one too, because I know from my wife and I, it can be the difficulty of inviting people in is sometimes you think, well, the house has to be spotless. We've got to do all the work to prep it, there is something to just inviting people into our real lives and just sharing that. And it might look a little messy, or, it might not be perfect, but nobody's life is perfect, right?
Nobody's is.
Right.
We pretend, we pretend that our lives look a certain way, but when somebody is coming through the back door and you're not even home, and they're seeing how we live. But I know what I hope is that they're thinking like, oh, good, they live just like we do, because I think we're all kind of living the same sort of life. It's just, we've got to get over that hurdle of being the first ones to kind of let the cat out of the bag.
Yep. So I'd be really interested to see what you think about this question, because I know, in Christian circles specifically, this idea of neighboring, or maybe another Christianese word you sometimes hear, is fellowship, right? Sometimes there's a difference in the way we talk about that with people who are, quote unquote, in the body of Christ versus people who are not.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a difference in the way we neighbor those two separate groups, or how does that practically play out for you?
That's a great question. I would say most of our connections are with people who we are not connected to, I guess, by faith. This isn't to say that people don't have a faith experience of their own, but that's not the primary connection, or that we might not even necessarily know. I think I'm learning, and I've been learning, continue to learn, not to make assumptions about somebody's faith experience, just because for me, it looked a very certain way when I was younger, or even in early adulthood. And so I had these ideas about kind of what marked somebody as a person of faith. And I've come to see how faulty that lens is. So a lot of times you might not necessarily know, but beyond that, or maybe even not beyond that, but as a part of that, a lot of the people that we end up in connection with as neighbors are through the jail. So these are people who have been incarcerated and are now kind of rebuilding and, trying to re-enter and all those different things. And so there can be the assumption that if you've been incarcerated, you certainly need faith. So that's the first thing. And that's not true. I would say most people have a foundation of faith. It might look very different than mine. It might be a completely different faith than mine.
Yep.
But I think there's just something to, I'm reflecting on a lot of these friendships and relationships, and there's just a real rawness and a vulnerability. It's easier for me, for Corey and I, for our family, it's easier to be in connection a lot of times with people who are not overtly people of faith, or like I said, who that's not the primary connector. And so again, it can be a challenge. The challenge can be building relationships with somebody who has a very kind of, I don't know, the faith experience that I grew up with, that it looks a certain way. and there's a lot of time and energy put into appearance, and not just physical appearance, but just like, making sure that the secrets don't get out.
Yep.
The secrets that we all carry. I've learned so much about vulnerability, and even vulnerability with God, vulnerability within my faith, from people who don't have all these layers of protection around it, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. Kind of what you're getting at there at the end. And one of the things we've talked about on the podcast is like, one of the ideas of saying we all need each other is not just that we all need each other like for a transactional relationship, right? Like you give me something and I give you something, but it's like we all need each other so that we can both understand God better. Like there's this other side of it that like I'm now going to grow in my faith because I'm seeing how God is working in your life or in someone else's life. And I think that transfers to this idea of neighboring, because it's like, as I'm attempting to be a neighbor to someone, or maybe even more accurately, as I'm being neighbored by another person, I'm seeing how God is neighboring me, right? Like I'm seeing that mirrored in that relationship. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, we do in each other, we get a really rich and a truer picture of who God is and how God loves us.
Absolutely.
And we just, it's more one-dimensional if we're surrounding ourselves with people who have learned to see the world from the same lens that we've learned to see the world. And so there's just this kind of disruptive, really sort of, maybe chaotic is not the right word. I use that as a compliment. I mean, there's just this disruptive energy in viewing God in a much wider way. So one of my favorite books is Tattoos on the Heart by Greg Boyle.
Yep.
And he has a line in that book that says, how much bigger is the God we have than the God we think we have? And I think we see more of the bigness of God when we see God through the lives of the people around us, and through hopefully a pretty wide variety of people. That's where we do see some of that bigness of God. And I don't think we've seen it all. I think that's part of this, the excitement that we can have for this ride, this wild ride. But to see that reflected off of different humans around us is just the best thing.
Yeah. So I want to be careful with this next question. I can sometimes, I'm 29, and so have experienced a small window of life so far. Sometimes it's easy to feel like the stuff we're going through in our culture, in our world today, is like either tougher or easier, depending on which way you look at it, than any other generation has had. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you hear it talked about that, and I don't know that that's always true, but certainly the last year plus has been very trying, and there's been some very difficult things that have happened for all of us, right? I'd be interested to see how has this idea of neighboring changed for you? Obviously the pandemic, but then a lot of racial unrest specifically over the last year plus. You kind of talked about the different political views that sometimes we come into conflict with it. Like a lot of this stuff swirling all at once. Like has the idea of neighboring changed in any tangible way for you over the last year plus?
I don't think it has changed. I mean, I think the pandemic really made it very difficult. That was just it was honestly, even not to be too dramatic, but it was something I kind of grieved, was that, I mean, understandably, everybody went inside and stayed there. And that was a really hard thing. It broke my heart last summer when the kids that my kids used to spend all day running around the yards with, that wasn't happening. And it felt like it was such a pivotal time, like they were right on that edge of getting older when they stopped doing those things anyway. It was really hard for me, and just hard to not be able to have those connections, those regular connections, hard to not have people in my home. So yes, in that sense, things changed. And in some ways we're kind of rebuilding, or just kind of in some ways back to business as usual a little bit. And so that's comforting to see that those long relationships are still holding. But with sort of the political and racial tension, I would say I am, for some of my neighbors, that person that has signs in my yard that make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, this is a two-way street and it goes both ways. And I'm aware of that. So my hope is, and I see this as in them as well, they're the people in my mind that when I'm tempted to think, you know, when I'm tempted to categorize people, or I'm tempted to just write people off, or I just can't get around the fact that they're still kind to me, and I'm wearing my feelings on my sleeve and they're doing the same, and we're, you know, it's very clear what's happening here. It's very clear that we're not moving out in the world in the same direction. But I hope they feel the same of me. I hope that when they just, you know, are just furious with a certain sort of person, that they remember me, and that they can think like, well, but she's still like annoyingly a nice person, you know, like it's like it would just be so much easier if we could just be terrible to each other and write each other off, but we're not doing that.
Yeah.
And I guess I would say, you know, the past couple of years I've become more aware of that feeling of sort of wishing sometimes that everybody around me could think exactly as I do. The problem with that is that's sort of the life I came from. You know, like I used to be in this echo chamber and we moved out of the echo chamber, right? And now it can be so tempting to want to be back in an echo chamber, just a different one, maybe. I think we need to stay disrupted, and we need to stay uncomfortable, and we need to just keep contending with the tension of this is hard and it's complicated and we're going to get frustrated with each other. But when we keep meeting each other as neighbors, and we keep sort of just basic kindness and basic kind of taking care of each other in small ways, when we keep that at the forefront, it does mess things up for us a little bit. It makes it a little harder to draw these hard lines and to just kind of write people off.
Yep.
I think that's kind of what God would want right now, you know, to keep living with conviction. I'm not into peacekeeping, but I'm very much into peacemaking. And so sometimes that means, you know, being bold and consistent with things that are important to me, but finding the tension and kind of just being in the tension with people who feel otherwise.
That's so good. That is so good. Well, I know we're quickly coming up on our time, but I do have to sneak in one last question, because this is one that I always like to ask people. You can take this any way you want.
Okay.
But I'm always interested in whether this is some type of art or sports, wherever you want to go with this. But what's something right now that's just fascinating you?
I'm fascinated constantly. And if you follow me on Instagram, you already know this, but I'm fascinated by the sky all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I care about the sky. This is new to my life since living in this neighborhood, and it just keeps building in intensity. My kids just know now that that's the way their mom is. I'm fascinated by the sky. So that's the first part. I'm right now fascinated by flowers. I love flowers. I'm growing flowers, and I'm in like my sweet spot right now. You know, August, September are peak flower season.
Yep.
But I'm finding that it's really vital for me to find things that are beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I've been even just, I've got a spiral notebook, just, you know, one of the 25% back to school. I grabbed a new one for myself, and I've been writing down every day one thing that I found beautiful. And I really, it tends to be something that, you know, didn't cost money necessarily, or wasn't, you know, some big extravagant thing, but just a moment, or sometimes it might be the sky. Things feel so hard in so many ways. I am a justice person. I am wired to fight for the underdog at all times. And there are so many people being oppressed in different ways, and injustice everywhere. And I can just feel the anger rising in me.
Yeah.
And I've been asking myself a lot, like, you know, and asking God, I mean, what can I do? Like, I cannot live like this, but I don't want to lose that fiery part of me. And I think at least part of the answer is beauty, you know, finding beauty so that we can continue in the work of justice, because there is something beautiful every single day.
Yeah. I did wonder if you were going to say anything about the sky, because you take beautiful pictures of the sky. I do see a lot on your Instagram.
So I did not
sky.
disappoint you.
No, yeah, no, that's great. Well, on that note, definitely everyone make sure you go and follow Shannan on Instagram. Shannan, is there another place people can go outside of Instagram to keep up with your work? And
I'm on Twitter. My spicy side lives on Twitter. I'm at Shannan Writes in both places, and I love them both. I'm on both of them most days. The best place to really track with me, though, would be to sign up for my email list. It's called The Soup, and there's a free version. And for people that want to hear from me more often, there's like a $5 a month version. But either way, you can find the link to those in my Instagram bio. And that's just the best way to kind of keep in touch with what I'm working on and what I'm doing, and to just kind of get a peek into my life.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll make sure all of that is in the show notes for today. And yeah, just thank you so much again for being here. This has been
Thank you. I loved it. Thanks for having me on.
Of course.